without further ado, let's get started now, and I will introduce Ned Bohman and Kayla Henry. Ned and Kayla are biologists from another local birding group, Great Basin Bird Observatory, who is based here in Reno, but they do conservation work all over the state of Nevada and even into other states like Utah and Arizona. They have done plenty of amazing birding events and helped us out, say, with our Pinion Jay surveys, as well as with the Spring Wings Birding Festival, and finally, the Nevada Birdathon. So we are so honored to have Ned and Kayla with us and give us our first lecture all about woodpeckers. So take it away, Ned and Kayla.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Parker, and thanks for having us here tonight. It's really cool to be here. So I will go ahead and share my screen and my sound. All right, so we're going to talk about woodpeckers tonight. And we're lucky to be here in Nevada, where we have a ton of really neat woodpeckers and a huge diversity of habitats. We will cover pretty much the woodpeckers found in the Sierra Nevada, and we're going to mention some of the others found in other parts of the state and adjacent areas. But before I get started, I just want to say there is just so much information, and forgive me if I don't talk about every point that you see on my slides. There is just far too much to cover about these fascinating creatures, and every species I looked into was a rabbit hole in itself. So but we have it structured into sort of species accounts. But before we get into the different species, I just wanted to mention a few brief things about woodpeckers in general and how they're hugely important for habitat creation, for nesting habitat for so many species, and that in some areas they're keystone species because they're the only critter providing habitat for certain species to nest. Further north, I know in Alaska, I spent some time, the buffleheads and goldeneyes are cavity nesters, and they entirely rely on cavities excavated by the northern flicker. And if it weren't for the presence of flickers up there, they would have far reduced nesting habitats. But also there's a whole suite of species that are called secondary cavity nesters, which use cavities excavated by woodpeckers. And some of these are swallows, like violet green swallows are a good example. They use tree cavities, bluebirds, chickadees, a number of songbirds use woodpecker cavities. But in addition to their excavation of cavities, they capitalized on disturbed forests and bring life to otherwise lifeless places. For example, after high intensity burns where there's nothing left, black-backed woodpeckers are often among the first colonists of these areas. And similarly with forests that are subject to beetle pests, bark beetles and infestations like that, the woodpeckers will move in and colonize and take advantage of this. So they truly are important, vastly important to the habitat that they inhabit. And they have some really fascinating details about their anatomy that allow them to do this. Their tongue actually wraps around their brain and cushions it while they're hammering on tree trunks to prevent them from getting concussed while they do this. But they're just fascinating. Like I said, it was a rabbit hole, every species I looked into. And we'll try to get into this now. A quick list of some of the species found in the Sierra. And the ones marked with asterisks are not necessarily in our area, but we felt were worth mentioning because they occur close enough that and are similar to other species worth mentioning as confusion species and species to seek out in your free time, that while they're not necessarily in the Reno area, they're not too far. So first is the Acorn Woodpecker. And this is one of them that is not necessarily in the Reno area, but as close as Susanville. They're incredibly common. Anywhere there's oaks, and there's just not a lot of oaks on our drier east side of the Sierra. but they do show up in Nevada. We do have records. Some maybe more often in southern than in northern. We don't review them anymore, so we're not soliciting this documentation like we used to. But currently in the Nevada Bird Records Committee database, there's 9 records in southern Nevada and 4 in northern. So it just kind of goes to show that they wander around and they turn up in weird places. But that's their range map there, and they really only regularly occur in like 5 states, I think. But they extend pretty far down into Mexico and South America. So they have a lot of interesting stuff going on with their taxonomy. They're primarily, so you can see actually in this photo, that's a granary tree where they cache their acorns. And so family groups will visit this tree and cache acorns and then collect them when, collect them in the springtime and cache them in the fall. But they also fly catch, and that's one of their main sources of food. The crappy photo down there is of an individual fly catching that actually has a insect in his bill. I have a couple of recordings of their vocalizations that, in the interest of time, I'll just I'll play them quickly. And this. So both of those are very common calls of theirs that sound pretty distinct from any other woodpecker. So the Lewis's woodpecker is one of my favorites just because of how striking they are with their green iridescent back, red face, red breast pattern. They're just a gorgeous, striking bird. And they're related to acorn, red-bellied, red-headed woodpeckers. They're in that same genus. They are migratory. Like some of our other woodpeckers are migratory, but a lot of our woodpeckers are resident. So in our area, you'll see these guys in the spring and summer. You can see from their range map that they're migratory throughout most of the state, and they breed in northern Nevada, typically in mountainous areas with aspen and cottonwood, but they do sometimes use burned areas. And one of the easiest ways to spot them is their distinct flight style. Most woodpeckers have a very classic rapid wingbeat gliding flight style, maybe slightly undulating, but Lewis's woodpeckers are just vastly different. They fly like crows with these slow rowing, dramatic wing beats, the very buoyant flight. And when you catch a glimpse out of the corner of your eye of one, they're just very, very distinct, and it makes you double take. But unlike a lot of our woodpeckers, they're not particularly vocal. I very rarely hear them vocalize, and it's typically contact calls around nests. But I do have a few examples of their calls that I will play. So those are some of the contact calls that they make when they meet at the nest tree, when they bring food to the incubating female or to nestlings. And then this is another call that they make. And so that they'll sometimes make that call. It's not exactly a contact call. I'm not sure what its exact function is, but it's maybe the most common call I've heard them make. Like I said, they're migratory. They're only in our area in the summer months, and they spend their winters in deserty places and further south. But they'll sometimes form large groups in the wintertime. I've seen, not personally seen, but I've seen reports of groups of 10 to 20 birds in suburban parks in the wintertime. But they have an interesting diet. They eat ants and some ground insects like flickers do. They'll also fly catch and glean insects from foliage and branches. And apparently a majority of their food comes from fly catching in the Sierra Nevada. And I've actually not seen one fly catch before, but Apparently that's their main source of food in the Sierra Nevada. But they'll also cache acorns and other fruits. And I think that's more in the fall and winter time when insects are becoming less abundant. They'll cache things. And so I tried to include good places to see these birds in our area. And I have seen them in the Sierra, but I can't think of a reliable spot for them in the Sierra. But I will say that I spent some time surveying in northeastern Nevada on the Marys River, and I have never seen so many Lewis's woodpeckers. I surveyed a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer block, and there were at least 20 individuals on the plot. Like every tree had a nest in it. It was I couldn't believe it. I had no idea they were that common in the breeding season anywhere in their range, but it was pretty cool to see that. So that's what I got for where to go find a Lewis's woodpecker. Moving into the sap suckers, the first one is a Williamson Sapsucker, which is more of a high elevation specialist. It's kind of how they separate themselves from the other sapsuckers on the landscape. And you can see from the range map there, their breeding range is higher mountain ranges where they have that little sliver in the Sierra, a couple spots in eastern Nevada, and then in northwestern Nevada. I think that's the Warner Mountains, and I'm not sure what's on the other side of the border in Oregon there. But so the males are a lowercase black-backed woodpecker. When you see one, the unmarked blackback is a good field mark because a lot of woodpeckers are easily identifiable by their back pattern. And so the males have that unmarked black back, red throat, and a yellow belly. And the females are a bit different looking. I've got a photo of one on the following slide, but they're a bit more brown and barred and a little messier looking, not as striking as the male. But while I was looking into these guys, I learned about this fascinating ecology of the sap wells that they dig. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the sap wells that sapsuckers excavate in trees, these horizontal rows of tiny, regularly arranged holes. And so these are, there's much more than meets the eye to these. So some of these sap wells tap into the xylem tissue of the tree, and apparently these are circular holes. And some of these tap into the phloem, which is a more nutrient-rich food. It's the food source. It's the food that the tree is transporting down its trunk. So it's more nutrient-rich. And these are square holes. And so they transition through the season depending on what the trees are doing, where they'll start with xylem, sap wells, and conifers, and then move to the deciduous trees once those are leafed out. And then later in the season, they'll move into the phloem, and that's how they start. That's what they're feeding on when they're raising their kids. And so, and they maintain these sap wells. If they don't regularly visit them and maintain them, the sap wells will actually dry up. So they're very busy architects out there running around maintaining their sap wells. And sometimes these sap wells will catch insects like ants, and that's an important food source for them as well. But they have, so I said at the beginning how woodpeckers' tongues actually extend very far from the tip of their bill to allow them to gather insects from in there. Our sapsuckers actually don't have as long of tongues as the other woodpeckers, and they're more specialized for gathering sap. They're covered in these short bristly hairs that allow the sap and the insects caught within it to adhere to their tongues. And there's a photo of a female here. You can see she's black and white barred, brown face, yellow bellied. But their vocalizations, in addition to their physical appearance, their vocalizations are very distinct from our other sapsuckers. And so I've got a few recordings of that I can play here. It's sort of a raspy, all of their vocalizations are pretty raspy and scoldy. That one's termed their chuckle series. And so here we have another one. That's what I was looking for. This is the drum. So they do these bursts of drumming that actually get shorter in the sequence, so they may seem to accelerate where the other sapsuckers appear to decelerate in their drums. So the drum is actually very distinct. But so like I said before, they're a higher elevation woodpecker, and that's sort of how they separate themselves from the other sapsuckers that will use similar habitat. And there is overlap with our other sapsuckers, so these are very general terms here. But that photo is a male at a nest cavity, and he actually has a bill full of ants stuck together with sap. And apparently they have the highest dependence on ants of any woodpecker in the US, which before putting this presentation together, I would have told you that was the flicker. But Williamson Sapsucker is hugely reliant on ants once the eggs hatch, because they exclusively feed on the sap and the phloem, but then they'll switch to insects once their eggs hatch, because the insects are more rich for their developing young. And so in the Reno, Tahoe area, your higher elevation spots are going to be your best bet to see them. Spooner Summit and Tahoe Meadows are a few places that come to mind where I've seen them in our area. But a gorgeous woodpecker. I've actually, and they do migrate like all the sapsuckers. They spend their, did I go over that? No. So let's go back to this range map. They spend their winters in the southern deserts and in Mexico, but they are resident in the Reno, Tahoe area. And that range map doesn't show that, but they do breed and in the Spring Mountains in Las Vegas and southern Nevada as well. But so they're found in our area year round. And our next sapsucker is the red Nape Sap Sucker, which is typically not found in the Sierra or Tahoe area, but they do come very close. You can see on the range map, they sort of get to the western extent of their range in the Pine Knot Mountains by Carson City. And so all sapsuckers are migratory. These guys breed in northern Nevada, and they spend their winters in, again, the southern deserts and in Mexico. In terms of physical appearance, they're most similar to the yellow-bellied, which is the eastern species of sapsucker. We have seen them in Nevada, but it's a very rare occurrence. And so, and I have a few slides to talk about this in a little bit, but hybridization among the sapsuckers is very well documented, and potentially red-naped, red-breasted sapsucker hybrids are the most abundant sapsucker in Nevada. So that individual in the photo looks to be a good pure red-naped sapsucker, but I've got some photos later on of some messier individuals that don't look so clean-cut. So both sexes have the red patches on the nape, the throat, and the crown. The female's throat patch is partially white, and the male's is fully red. So in that photo, that's a male bird. The throat patch differs from the yellow-bellied, but that's the best way to tell them apart, is that for the yellow-bellied sapsucker, the throat is fully enclosed in a black border, and on the red-nape, the red bleeds out over that black border. But otherwise, they can be very tough to tell apart. That white wing patch is typical of all sapsuckers, and contrary to the suggestion from the names, all sapsuckers have a hint of yellow in the belly, even Williamson's. So they drill sap wells anywhere and everywhere. I've seen them in yucca in the low desert, willow saplings as big around as your finger. And I've actually learned that some hummingbirds time their migration for when these sap wells are running. So the hummingbirds won't show up until the sap wells are running. I think particularly back east with the ruby-throated and yellow-bellied sapsucker, it's a hugely important food source to them on migration. but I do have a very fond memory of watching black-chinned and broad-tailed hummingbirds feeding on red Nape Sap Sucker wells in the Toyabe Mountains in central Nevada. So they prefer mixed conifers, sometimes pinyon juniper, but your wetter pinyon juniper, not really the drier pinyon juniper you see a lot, and aspen stands. And they are a cavity nester like all of our woodpeckers. And they're commonly found in cottonwoods during migration and winter. You'll see them lower down. They're not necessarily an altitudinal migrant like the red-breasted is, but they move mostly south in the wintertime. Let me move my thing here and I play some recordings for you. So their vocalizations are typical of all sapsuckers and are actually not reliably told from red-breasted or yellow-bellied. They are very distinct from Williamson's, but these other three are very similar sounding. So we'll quickly play the drum for you. It's a very distinct drum, kind of stuttering, irregular rhythm that seems to decelerate as it slows down at the end there. They have a mew call. And then finally, they have this squeal series that's actually, it almost reminds one of a gull. So, hold on a second. So when you're birding in the forest and you think you hear a gull, you might want to be looking for a sapsucker instead. But again, they share these vocalizations pretty much identically with red-breasted and yellow-bellied. But I do have recordings of red-breasted that I'll play shortly. So red-breasted is the expected sapsucker in our area. They're found throughout the Sierra Nevada. And then in the wintertime, they move down slope and you can see them in neighborhoods, lowland, cottonwoods, that kind of thing. Their head is fully red. Their only facial marking is that white stripe over the bill. And actually this individual in the photo is a female and you can kind of see a hint of that face pattern shared with other sapsuckers. And some of my reading did get me wondering if this bird might have some mixed genetics, and possibly it does, but it appears to mostly be a female red-breasted sapsucker. So the sexes are dimorphic, but barely. Basically, it's the strength of the face pattern. The males have a fully red head, and you can kind of see a hint of that face pattern on the females. The juvenile sapsuckers can be confusing when you see them. They're real dark, streaky-looking woodpeckers, and they actually hold their juvenile plumage well into the fall and winter, so it can throw you off when you see one. But juvenile red-breasteds are very dark with really no hint of a face pattern. I think I do have a photo of one there. That lower left is a juvenile, and you can see maybe a hint of a face pattern, but pretty dark throughout. And then the adult on the right is a male, and you can see it's just fully red with a little white stripe over the bill. And so here are their vocalizations. So that's their mew call, which sounds identical to red-naped. Fortunately, they separate out by range fairly nicely, and you can generally know what sapsucker is expected in your area. And there's that squeal series that sounds remarkably like a gull. And finally, the decelerating drum. So that's the drum. It's a very irregular sounding advertisement drum that's immediately recognizable as a sapsucker and very different from our other woodpeckers. There looks to be an adult male with another juvenile. You can see the juvenile, just very, very dark head without much going on for a pattern. But so further north of us is where a lot of the hybridization occurs in British Columbia and the Northern Cascades. That's where the range overlaps with red-naped. But in the Sierra Nevada and Tahoe area, they tend to use lower moisture forest than Williamsons. So that's how they separate themselves from Williamsons. But again, there is overlap, and I quite frequently see them both in the same areas. But they drill sap wells on migration like other sapsuckers. They maintain the sap wells in the same fashion as I've described earlier with the Williamsons, and they transition to feeding their young insects once they hatch. And in the Reno area, I've seen them at Crystal Peak Park, at Spooner Lake. In the wintertime, I've seen them in backyards in Reno. I've actually seen Williamsons in backyards in Reno too on migration. But so they typically, like I said before, separate by range very generally. The yellow-bellied is found in the eastern U.S., red-naped is throughout the Intermountain West, and the red-breasted is the Pacific Coast, far west. And then Williamson's is throughout the west, but higher elevation. And so that bird on the lower left is an immature red-naped. I don't think I highlighted that when I was talking about them before, but a bit more. You can see that face pattern pretty distinctly. And the bird on the lower right is a red-naped by red-breasted sapsucker hybrid. So you can see a bit of that face pattern. However, there is solid red going on the crown and the throat, but that face pattern showing through is not the typical appearance of a female red-breasted, and much more face pattern than a male should show. So beware of the hybrid sapsuckers. Both of these birds in the photos are apparent hybrids. So red-breasted and yellow-bellied, the ranges don't overlap. Red-naped and yellow-bellied hybridize where their ranges overlap, and red-naped and red-breasted is possibly the most common sapsucker seen in Nevada. So it's worth paying close attention to your sapsuckers. They're much more likely encountered in northern Nevada than even a yellow-bellied or yellow-bellied hybrid. But these sort of mixed field marks are the best ways to pick them out. You can see both of these birds. They look funny. They don't look right for either. There's just a bit more face pattern than a red-breasted should show, but a bit too much red for a red-naped. So further north, these birds are regularly hybridizing, and they disperse through our area in the winter. And the hybrid juveniles are a treat to try to identify. But moving on from the sapsuckers, we have our northern flicker, which is possibly our most common woodpecker. If I had a nickel for every time I was birding and heard someone say, "Oh, just a flicker." They are still really cool though. The current subspecies used to be considered separate species. So the red shafted is the western form and the yellow shafted is the eastern form, where, yeah, western birds are red under the wing and tail, eastern birds yellow. That bird in the photo is kind of a messy individual with the red malar stripes of the red shafted, but the yellow undertail of the eastern bird. So likely some mixed genetics with that individual. But in the Reno Tahoe area, they use cottonwoods, they use PJ, they use mixed conifers. They're incredibly general in their habitat preferences. Pretty much anywhere where there are trees with suitably sized cavities, you can find a flicker. So Oxbow Nature Preserve right in town, McCarran Ranch, Galena Creek, Tahoe Meadows, they are pretty much all over the place. So the two forms were formerly separated by the Great Plains, but humans have been steadily planting trees and allowing eastern and western species to come into contact here, where they hybridized. And in 1965, the flickers were lumped into a single species when Short was documenting extensive hybridization. And so, as I said before, when I was talking about the Williamsons, these guys are definite anteaters. They forage on the ground almost exclusively, but it turns out ground beetles and other ground-dwelling invertebrates are important food sources. And then in the fall and winter, they switch to fruits and berries, and you'll see them in fruiting trees with the robins and waxwings in that time of year. And so both birds on the previous slide were males with that red malar stripe. So only the male is going to show that malar stripe. And this bird with the plain face is a female. The color of the malar stripe is an indication of the subspecies as well. The eastern birds have black malars and the western birds have red malars. Both sexes of eastern birds show red on the nape, which sometimes our western birds can show, and that does suggest mixed genetics. But so this bird with the plain face is a female. And I have some recordings of their vocalizations to play. So the most common one is the clear call, which I believe is this one. Yes. And that is a very familiar sound to most of you. They also have this. Mostly I see / hear birds doing this as a contact call when the pair comes together at the nest tree or something like that. When the young are begging, when the male comes in with a food delivery, is often when you'll hear that. And so that's the kek series that can be possibly confused with the pileated, but it's generally like more stereotyped, like less variable. It's slower and lower. It can be long, but generally not more than 20 seconds, where the pileated will just go on and on and on and on. And I'm sure Kayla will have a recording of that when we get to her slide. Just play it again. So very evenly pitched throughout and not as long as the pileated. And finally, I'll just play the drum for you. And woodpecker drums can be pretty tough to identify, the advertising drums. They do sound different in the field from your like hairy or downy types. It might maybe a little more muffled or hollow sounding. It's got a different quality to it, but it's really tough to tell unless you're very close to the bird. And the Downy Woodpecker is our smallest woodpecker in the US, and you can see from the range map they are very widely distributed. In our area, they're almost always in cottonwood or aspen or ornamental trees in your backyard, but they're not necessarily a lower elevation woodpecker because they will use high elevation aspen stands, and I have found them in the aspen in the Santa Rosa Mountains, for example, in north central Nevada. But there are apparent differences in the male and female foraging strategies, and this is true for hairy woodpecker as well, where the females will use lower down on the trunk and larger branches, and the males will use the smaller branches and further out on the limbs. And I'm not entirely sure why this is, but it is well documented in the literature. but not necessarily between hairy and downy, as one might think. The downy does definitely use its size to capitalize on different food sources than other woodpeckers, but also feeds differently on the food sources than other woodpeckers, where, for example, it can cling to a large nut and use its tiny bill to get insects out of crevices in it, for example, whereas another woodpecker would perch on the trunk and try to peck into the nut. But you can see them all over Reno, every backyard, Rancho San Rafael, but then also up in the Aspen at Spooner Summit and places like that have them as well. So they're very similar in appearance to the hairy woodpecker. They're black and white, barred all over. They have the unbroken white back patch. The male has red on the nape and the female does not. Both downy and hairy have big tufts at the base of their bill, which is kind of variable from individual to individual. But the hairy is going to have a longer bill, almost as long as the width of the head, whereas the downy's bill is dinky and noticeably shorter than the width of its head. But also there's some plumage differences that can be difficult to see depending on your view. But on this bird, you can see the black barring. I don't know if everyone can see my mouse, but the black barring on the outer tail feathers there, and a hairy is going to be entirely white there, unmarked. And then up on the shoulder of the bird here, the hairy is going to show a black spur onto the white of the chest, and the downy does not show that. And then also general size. Hairies are generally larger and downies are generally smaller, but these relative field marks can be very difficult without seeing the birds side by side. So they're pretty vocal, and their peak and their whinny call are the most common vocalizations, which are both distinct from the hairy. I'll play them here, but the peak call is softer and maybe not quite as squeaky or sharp as the hairy. And then the whinny is descending. The whinny goes down. It's an easy way to remember. The downy goes down and the hairy stays even. But here we go. So that was the peak call. And you can hear that whinny just descending in pitch at the end. And I have a recording of their drum, which I don't know if is reliably separable in the field by ear from hairy. So a rapid, even drum, and you can hear the difference between that and the sapsuckers, for example. So the hairy woodpecker may be found at slightly higher elevations than downy in our area. I don't know if that's true throughout the range, and it's definitely not a rule here. It's maybe just a general trend. I think they can tolerate drier conditions, and they'll use conifers more readily, where you'll frequently find them in pretty dry PJ, coniferous forest, sometimes in cottonwoods and aspen. They definitely co-occur with downies. And they overlap in habitat with the sapsuckers as well, but again, they seem to tolerate much drier conditions than our other woodpeckers. And a little bit more widespread in range than the downy as well. You can see they extend all the way down the Sierra Madre into Mexico, pretty far actually. And the bird in the photo, you can see the bill length relative to head, and then just barely you can see that shoulder spur. The tail feathers, the outer tail feathers are unmarked, but you can just barely see that on this bird. You can see that shoulder spur a little better in this photo. It's actually the same bird. So similar to downy, longer bill. Those white outer rectrices are very tough to see. You need a good look, or the underside of the bird, because you can see from the underside of the tail fairly well. But some of the, maybe this will highlight some of the differences in their vocalizations. Let's see if this is the peak. So it's maybe squeakier. Just it's a bigger, more forceful sound, and it's pretty distinct in the field once you've heard a few of them. I just threw that one in there because it's not one you hear very frequently, but it's definitely a cause for confusion with a flicker. So the hairy woodpecker definitely has a wicka wicka similar to a flicker. I believe this will be the whinny. Oh, we got the drum. So you can hear it's very fast and even. Distinct from the sapsuckers, pretty tough to tell from the downy. And then this will be your whinny. Should be a whinny here. There was a little bit of a rattle in there. That was a poor description, but their rattle stays even. It doesn't drop off and descend at the end like the downy does. So a very abundant woodpecker. I've seen fierce competition with downy woodpeckers where the two occur side by side. I was looking into it a little bit and did see some evidence of hybrids. I am not exactly sure what to say about the bird in the photograph there. It looks short-billed like a downy, but that huge tuft at the base of the bill could potentially be obstructing your view of what is otherwise a longer bill. You can see the shoulder spur there, which downy doesn't typically show. And the outer retrice looks unmarked, but you can't actually see the whole thing. So if I saw that bird in the field, I would try to get a better photo of all the different parts of it. I'm not sure I could identify that bird from that photo. I just wanted to throw it in there to highlight that they're not always so straightforward and easy to separate, in that birds do funny things to confuse us. Particularly young birds I've been confused by. I distinctly remember a survey on the Truckee River where there was a bird that looked by all means to be a downy woodpecker, but the calls it was making were clearly a hairy woodpecker's calls. And then finally, I did see an adult hairy come into this immature bird that was mature enough to not be a dependent young fledgling, but not quite old enough to not be begging. But anyways, it can take a little while for the bill to reach its full length, apparently. So you can see these birds, they're pretty common in our area. Maybe not as much so in the neighborhoods as your downies, but Alum Canyon, Peavine, McCarran Ranch are all good spots to see the hairy woodpecker. Well, now I am going to turn it over to Kayla, and she is going to talk to you about the rest of these woodpeckers. So I'll go ahead and stop my share, Kayla, and you can start one up.
I was gonna say, let us know what you all think about that downy / hairy woodpecker in the last slide, because we are both undecided.
Yeah, please chime in the chat. Let us know your thoughts.
One second. I believe I was on slide 29. All right, can you all see my screen?
I can.
Great. I'm actually not sure if I clicked to share my sound, so I'm going to review this real quick. Sorry, everybody.
Boy.
I was supposed to remember. Oops. Oh, I did. Okay, good. Need to hear some recordings. Okay, so I'm going to take over from here. Thanks, Ned, for present.
Kayla, I'm not seeing your presentation. Is your PowerPoint up right now?
Oh, it is.
Oh, I'm just seeing your file explorer with a bunch of my photos.
My PowerPoint is up. Let me try again. Technical difficulties.
I can share mine again and just move through the slides if that'd be easier.
Let's try.
There we go.
You see now? Weird. Okay.
That looks good.
Okay, so we're here. Black-backed woodpecker. So black-backed woodpeckers, actually learning about these guys for this presentation, I think they're now my favorite woodpecker because I think they're very interesting and I learned a lot that I didn't know. So they're a medium-sized woodpecker, similar in size to hairy. So they're described as long-headed, short-tailed, relatively. Both sexes have a solid black back and heavily barred flanks and a single white stripe on the head, but males do show a yellow crown patch. This woodpecker is unlikely to be confused with any other species in our region of the Sierras, but I did want to touch on three-toed woodpecker very quickly because they can, I believe, overlap in the very northern part of this black-backed woodpecker's range. So in comparison, American three-toed woodpeckers have a solid or barred white back in contrast to the appropriately named black-backed woodpecker. Like the American three-toed woodpecker, black-backs only have 3 toes as well. And I found some interesting facts about that, for sure. So black-backed American three-toed and Eurasian three-toed woodpeckers do only have 3 toes on each foot, 2 facing forward and 1 facing backwards. All other woodpeckers have 4 toes. The term for this is zygodactyl, with 2 toes facing forward and 2 toes facing backward. And it's been suggested that the loss of this 4th toe in these species allows the woodpecker to lean further back and deliver harder blows to the tree, possibly helping them excavate nest holes in harder and therefore safer wood. And that's something I hadn't heard before. I don't think it's proven, it's just a theory. Alternatively, another paper I found, this paper is a bit dated, it was published in, I believe, 99, by Walter J. Bach, titled Functional and Evolutionary Morphology of Woodpeckers, suggests that the typical zygodactyl arrangement of woodpecker toes is more of an ancestral thing and was advantageous for perching. And then even in woodpecker species who have not lost that toe, one of the rear toes usually points sideways when the bird is climbing, not backwards. So it's not providing much support anyway. So the loss of the toe in the American three-toed and black-backed could simply be a matter of variations in evolution and not necessarily serve a purpose. And we just don't quite know. I have a couple vocalizations here. For black-backs, their calls are described as a sharp high pick or kick. This is similar to a hairy woodpecker, but deeper. I believe this is the males drum regularly. The drumming is described as fairly long and slow, but accelerating towards the end, or a series of deep taps that trails off. And I'll play that now. So they inhabit coniferous forests in North America and are found in high elevations. They often forage on charred blackish tree trunks where their dark plumage helps them blend in, as you can see here very well. And some scientists point to this evidence that severe forest fires have been shaping this species for millennia, and burned areas are a natural part of many landscapes. So black-backed woodpeckers, they are found in coniferous forests. The species is a specialist of burned areas and selects habitat with a higher density of snags than other woodpeckers, though they sometimes utilize other habitats with an abundance of dead trees, such as flooded areas and bogs and areas that have been hit hard by bark beetles. They're highly mobile and wander in search of these recently burned areas, and we don't know how they find them. They typically show up before and start colonizing before the next growing season. Is not fully understood how they find these areas, but it could have something to do with young birds dispersing when they hatch. Okay, so they have an interesting distribution here. They are notably absent from the Rocky Mountains, but present in the Sierra Nevada and Central California. A good place to see them is Lake Tahoe and Tahoe Meadows, the kind of higher elevations around the lake, not necessarily at lake level. Okay, Nettles Woodpecker here. They are slightly larger than a downy, but smaller than a hairy. They're distinguished from both of those species by the barring on the back. They do have, it's more apparent in the female here on the right. So the males do have the red cap, but they do have a solid black patch on their upper back. And this is a good way to distinguish them from ladder-backed woodpeckers, where their ranges possibly overlap pretty Southern California foothill areas. Let's see here. So they are a California species. They're more likely found on the western side of the Sierras between 900 and 5,500 feet. Their diet consists of insects such as beetles, beetle larvae, ants, and termites. And like the acorn woodpecker that Ned touched on earlier, they have a strong association with oak woodlands. However, unlike the acorn woodpecker, their primary food source is not acorns. So they can coexist with acorn woodpeckers and not compete for a food source. I'll just play, let's see, the most commonly heard is their high pitch, it's called. And their drumming is fast and even paced.
Hey, Kayla, before you go on to your next slide, that photo you've got of mine, I'm not so sure that is a Nuttles. It has a lot of plumage features that look like it. And so I took that photo and I originally thought it was a Nuttles. The bill is far too long for Nuttles, but the face pattern and the back pattern seemed pretty good for Nuttles. And I wanted to highlight sort of further south where their ranges overlap and they can potentially be confused with each other, potentially hybridize. There's some weird stuff going on down there in the Mojave Desert and Southern Sierra foothills where Nuttles and ladderback meet. So that bird in the photo is, I don't know what it is.
My next slide. So this is a photo of a ladderback that Ned also took on some cholla cactus of some type. And like Ned was saying, they are pretty reliably separated by range. Show a range map real quick, but you could see an area down here where there could possibly be overlap and therefore hybridize. The white-headed woodpecker, they are a medium-sized woodpecker with a white face and head. It is described by Sibley as entirely unlike any other North American bird. So they're very unique. The males have a little red crown patch here, and then they have white patches on the wings, which are actually the bases of the primary feathers, and it's very visible in flight. Let's see, they have a couple vocalizations here. I'll just play the high-pitched, sharp, the rapid peak-kick call. Let's see. And their drumming is very slow and even in cadence, similar to a Nettles woodpecker. Sounds a bit slower to me. So White-haired woodpeckers inhabit mature coniferous forests of western North America and are associated with old-growth ponderosa pine and sugar pine. Like black-backed woodpeckers, they are often found in recently burned forests, and this is another instance of two woodpecker species occupying the same habitat while not competing for food resources. So black-backed woodpeckers feed primarily on beetle larvae, and white-headed woodpeckers' diet consists of pine seeds, pine sap, but they will also forage for insects as well as spiders in the warmer months in breeding season. They seldom are found away from pines and favor large cones or trees with pretty prolific seed production, such as ponderosa, Jeffrey, and sugar pines. And they are generally a permanent resident of their range, though some individuals may move down to lower elevations in winter. You can look for this species at Crystal Peak Park and Verdi and at Galena Creek. And I believe Ned actually took this picture at Galena.
I sure did.
Cool. And just a little tip to find white-headed woodpeckers, look for large pines, particularly ponderosa pine, sugar pine. White-headed woodpeckers often cling to cones to extract seeds. So you might see them doing that. And therefore their foraging is pretty quiet. They're not like drumming around a bunch of other woodpeckers. So, Hilliated Woodpecker, perhaps the most well-known woodpecker, most striking. It's like my nemesis bird. I have never got a good look at one, though I've tried. So they're about crow size with a long, heavy bill. They're mostly black with white stripes on the face and head. Males and females both have a red crest. In comparison, males also have a red cheek patch, similar to how flickers do. This male is pictured on the right here and female on the left. So they inhabit mature deciduous or mixed deciduous woodlands of nearly every type. They are monogamous and hold large territories. They create distinctive oblong nesting holes, and in doing so provide crucial habitat for a variety of species, including owls, ducks, bats, even pine martens. Their diet is comprised primarily of carpenter ants, which is something I didn't know, but they will supplement with other ants and beetle species. They will also eat wild fruit and nuts and have been known to come to feeders as well. While foraging, they create deep rectangular excavations. So those are the foraging holes, and they use their long barbed tongue to extract wood-boring beetle larvae. So their vocalizations here, most commonly heard is the, let's see, the ping call. This is the call that's more similar, I think, to the northern flicker rattle call. Let's see if this is the right one. Kind of. They also do a short of their wuck call, just a bit slower. And their drumming is super powerful, slow, typically lasting about 3 seconds. And it's really cool to hear. It just like echoes through the forest. One more time. Yeah, it's just a very cool. Now we have a bunch going. Okay, so they are very tough to find in Nevada, and they weren't documented in the state until the late 90s. They're still only found a few places in the Tahoe Basin. Ned and I unsuccessfully tried to go see some, and we did a big day last week. The parking lot was closed, so we couldn't go. But a place they are known to be, according to a few eBird records I found, is Marlette Lake near Spooner Lake. So that may be a good place to see them in Nevada, though they do become more abundant the further you get into California. And these are our sources.
Kayla, that Murrelet Lake Trail is actually where the first pileated in Nevada was found too.
It was? Okay.
Yeah.
Not sure about that, but that's where
So
the
they're
eBird
still
records
there.
are still. That yeah, that'd be fun to hunt down sometime.
Yeah. I want to highlight the differences with the foraging and nesting holes too. I think that's pretty neat because their rectangular holes are very recognizable in the forest and is a good evidence that there's pileateds in the area, but their nest holes are obviously very large because they're a large bird, but the circle with the cut off corners doesn't allow as big of an entrance, so it's in the bird's best interest to have as small of an entry hole to their nest as possible to exclude possible predators. But I know we're way over, Parker. I'll stop rambling.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Now it's time for the Q&A session. So yes, for those of you watching, if you want to just click the Q&A button if you have a question, and then I will go through and ask Ned and Kayla as time goes on. While we're waiting, I have a comment for you. It's nice I definitely agree with your quote about the acorn woodpeckers being a California species. In fact, some of my friends and I considered petitioning the California government, making the California quail be the state game bird and the acorn woodpecker being the state bird, since they're so common in California.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be fun.
While we wait, Jenny or Diane, do you have any questions you want to ask?
Okay, how about this old question? What kind of woodpecker is Woody Woodpecker?
I think he was modeled after the acorn woodpecker.
Was he? Or redheaded? I'm not remembering exactly.
I actually think I was reading this in some of my research for this, that I think the artist was modeling them after the woodpeckers he was looking at his South Lake Tahoe vacation cottage.
You researched a cartoon?
I think it's in the Birds of the World account on Cornell. I think it's actually.
I have read that as well. Yes, I have read he also modeled that after Woody Woodpecker because the woodpeckers pecked holes in his cabin roof and made it leak.
That's funny. I have heard the acorn woodpeckers calls or be compared to Woody Woodpecker.
Yes.
As a way to. So maybe some truth to that.
Well, we have one question, which is, can you comment on the recent reports of seeing ivory-billed woodpeckers in the Southeast?
We were just talking about this.
Yeah, was it perched on top of a Bigfoot?
What did we decide, Ned, that they didn't?
I don't know.
We would like some vocalizations, maybe if they could report something.
I think I could stand to read some more into this article, but what I was reading was that they didn't have much for actual documentation. They had some game camera photos and they were unable to get actual photos, and then I don't know if they were unable to get recordings or what the deal was with the vocalizations, but the article I read left me with many questions. So I don't know. I'm thinking it along the lines of a Bigfoot sighting at this point.
What's that? There's a cool documentary about, I think it's called like Ghost Bird, where they follow birders looking for the ivory-billed woodpecker.
Yes, yes. Well, as an alternative, if any of you ever get a chance to go down to Costa Rica, where I went birding with our LAS trip, there is a bird called the pale-billed woodpecker, which is, I believe, genetically, it is the closest relative to the ivory-billed woodpecker. And I had the privilege of seeing those a couple times in the wild, and they are impressive birds.
Cool.
Nice.
Hey, I saw a comment in the chat earlier about Harrison Pass and the South Rubies, and I'm not sure when that came in, if that was in reference to I'm guessing in reference to the Lewis's woodpecker.
I think it was.
Yeah, so I'd heard that too, and I've been unable to chase them down at Harrison Pass, though I haven't tried many times, but I have seen them in other spots in the rubies, but
Mhm.
Harrison Pass didn't pan out for me personally.
I have a question. At one point I was out with somebody and they mentioned that you could identify which woodpecker had been scavenging on a tree based on the pattern of their pecks in in the tree trunk. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, a lot of them you can, not every single one, but definitely, for example, black-backed and three-toed have a very distinct foraging pattern where they'll flake chunks of the bark. They'll pry their bill under a corner of bark and like flick their head and flake the bark off. So you can get these trees that look like they've been scaled, like you would scale a fish or something. And so you can tell when a blackback has been in the neighborhood. We talked about pileateds have the big square rectangular foraging holes and they're massive, so that's pretty distinct. Obviously the sapsucker sap wells, I started to talk about a little bit the size of the individual holes in the sap wells, but as far as getting it down to species of sapsucker, I don't think you can. And then again, I don't know about separating like a hairy versus downy versus Nettles foraging pattern. I would think they'd all be pretty similar. But so there are some species you definitely can, but I wouldn't say that holds true for all of them. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Kayla, from your black-backed woodpecker research.
No, I was going to mention that. Yeah, the black-backed for sure. Other than that, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Have there been any other questions on the Facebook page, Jenny?
No, we haven't gotten any there.
All righty. Well,
Looks like one more just came in the Q&A.
Oh, great. Yes, if you have any questions, the clock is ticking now. This person says, I'm in Sacramento, about 30 feet above sea level. We regularly see noctals, at least that's what others have said. I think they're asking to see if that is a confirmation, if they are indeed seeing noctals, or if they are probably seeing another, species. Yes.
Yeah, I think Nettles would be very common in that area. So I definitely think you could possibly be seeing Nettles. I would think Downies would be around in the neighborhoods as well. So you can look at the back pattern is probably the best way to separate those two, where the Nettles is going to be barred evenly across the whole back, and Downy is going to have that big white patch and be a slightly smaller bird. But I would think both would be pretty common in the Sacramento urban suburban area.
Definitely. Yeah. What was that, Kayla?
Oh, I said definitely. I went to school in Sacramento and I would see both quite frequently.
Yes. I also lived in the Sierra foothills, and that's where I saw my first Nape woodpecker. They are all over and quite beautiful birds. Yes.
Pretty reliably separated by the vocalizations too. Their calls are pretty different. They have that gravelly, scratchy whinny versus the clearer descending rattle that the Downy does. And the pick calls are different as well.
Any other questions? Well, I think I haven't seen too many other questions yet, so I think that can be there's that was the last of our open questions, so we can call it a night. And a chat just came in that said, thank you, Ned and Kayla, for this great presentation, and I must also echo that. Oh wait, we had one more question, which is, what other woodpeckers look like a pileated? Meaning, are there any other woodpeckers here in the United States that have the head crest like a pileated?
None unless the ivory-billed is still out there somewhere.
Yes.
If you see a pileated with a pale bill, Better get a picture.
Yep,
If you find yourself in the swamps in Louisiana.
definitely, definitely. And maybe you can also get a picture of a Bigfoot holding it on his finger like that and letting it sing to him. All righty. Well, thank you again, Ned and Kayla, so much for joining us. For those of you watching, thank you for tuning in. We hope you will join us at our next Birds of Truckee Meadows webinar, the Water Birds with Mike Goddard, happening next week. Otherwise, all of you, take care and have a good night.
Thanks, Parker. Good night, all.